Hello and welcome to the Property Podcast. I'm Rob B with Rob D, and this week we're looking at a pretty expensive mistake Rob D's made. Now, we've been doing this for a long time, so mistakes will happen, but luckily we can turn them into lessons for you.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come together to be informed and inspired. Now, last week we talked about things that have gone wrong for us recently, but there are also things completely within our control that we regularly mess up as well. And this week we're focusing on one of mine, and wow, is it an expensive one. So I'm sure you won't want to miss that. And make sure you stick around all the way to the end, because in Hub Extra we've got a resource which is brilliant for bookworms.
Ah, yes, The Guardian. They hate money so much they refuse to make any. Right, let's look at this week's news story. So they are criticising Help to Buy. They are saying basically it's a government subsidy and that it helps developers, and they're the real winners from this. And there's not enough money going to social housing. And of all the billions they're putting into Help to Buy, that could be better used elsewhere. Well, guess what? I agree. I recently heard Help to Buy referred to as Help to Sell. And that's pretty much what it is. Help to Buy, as I see it, is really a government grant which aids home builders to get sales. Now, there are some people that benefit, and there are some buyers who get on the ladder because of Help to Buy. But there are 95% loan-to-value mortgages out there for first-time buyers that are not connected to Help to Buy. You can do this without Help to Buy. And what's interesting is the government continues to extend Help to Buy because they may see it as contributing to the economy, or they just don't have any better ideas, and I think it's probably the latter. It's really interesting that it's lasted as long as it has. And although they've put some more restrictions on recently, I think that money could be far better spent. Billions of pounds have pumped into this. And I think nearly every podcast listener could come up with 10 better uses for the money.
Yeah, it's not every day that you get us agreeing with a story in The Guardian, but I do think this is spot on for all the reasons you just said, Rob. And also on the social housing point, you get people complaining a lot about how much housing benefit goes into the hands of private landlords. But then they kind of have to, because people need to be housed somewhere. And if there's no social housing, then you need to pay private landlords to do it instead. You can have your own views on which system is best, and that's not worth getting into here. But the point is, if they don't like how it is now, then building social housing is the only alternative, and does seem like it would be a better use of money than Help to Buy.
So if you'd like to read this news story and follow along with the rest of the show notes this week, you can go to thepropertyhub.net/change strategy. That's thepropertyhub.net/change strategy.
All right, main topic this week. Oh, this episode appears to be called Rob D's Biggest Mistake in Property. This seems like it might be an uncomfortable one.
Yeah, sorry, Rob. Can't think of who named it. But let's push on.
Yeah, so the reason we're doing this episode is not because I lost a bet with Rob B. It's to bring out a really important lesson about strategy. It's something that we've touched on many times before, but the best way I think to really appreciate it is with an example. So I've pulled out an example that we'll be going through today, and wow, it was painful. Actually, it's a far bigger mistake than I thought it was. But before we get into that, let's put this into context. There's lots of different types of strategy in property, but today we're going to split it into two broad classes: growth and cash flow. So when we say growth, we're talking about buying property mainly for the capital appreciation. The income that you get from the rent is secondary. The main purpose is buying the property in the hope or expectation that it will go up in value. Cash flow is the opposite. It's buying predominantly for that rental income, and any growth that you get is just a bonus. So typically this would be buying high yielding properties, and perhaps also buying properties to refurb and try to pull that deposit back out so you can reinvest and get even more of that cash flow. So there are lots of subtypes within those, but for today's purposes, those are the categories that we're using.
So let me give you an example of who would want yield. So yield, it would be possibly somebody who wants to get out of work. They may dislike or even hate their current job, or they just want to retire and their current pension doesn't allow them, but retirement age is coming up fast. So those people will need a good yield because they need income, and they're not so concerned about where this portfolio is going to be in 5, 10, 20 years' time. So they may be looking at HMOs, they may be looking at properties in areas that aren't as glamorous as some others, but most importantly, what they're looking for is that bottom line, that cash flow, to give them that income to allow them to achieve their short-term goals. And for growth, it's going to be people who are in this for the long term. You may have no intention of retiring early or getting out of work in the next few years. You may enjoy what you do. Guilty. So you build a portfolio with the future in mind. So the type of properties you're going to go for are in what we call growth areas that you think, okay, these are going to do the best for capital growth appreciation over time. They often are not the best areas for yield. You will make a return and you will make some cash flow, but the people who go for those properties don't really care about an extra 50 quid, 100 quid here or there, because in the short term, that's not going to change their life. That's a Tesco shop. But the capital appreciation, if that comes off for them, the numbers are a lot bigger. Now, one of the most important things that you should take away from today is that you need to be very clear on which strategy is right for you. Are you chasing yield or are you chasing growth? You should be very deliberate with your choices. And occasionally, some people make a bit of a mistake and they aren't clear on what they go for. And that's exactly what happened to my good friend, Rob D. So, Rob, I think, first of all, it's worth saying that the value that people take away from our lessons is probably more than any other type of podcast. That's great that you're going to run through in detail an actual example of where you've got this wrong. So can you run through exactly what happened?
Yeah, so to be honest, when I started in property, I didn't really have a strategy. The first couple of properties I just bought the opportunities that I could see in places that were convenient and didn't give a great deal of thought to the bigger picture of the whole thing. After those couple, though, I was predominantly a yield investor. After that, when I learned a bit more and I knew what was possible with property, I became a cash flow investor. And that made sense for me at the time because I was having a career change, I was traveling a lot, and I just wanted like a backup income source that came in no matter what. That was more important to me at the time than where I would be in 20, 30 years. However, here's where I went wrong. Circumstances change. Things change. For most people, things don't stay static. And I failed to review my strategy in light of my changing circumstances. So I got to a point where I was happy with the income that I had coming in. And I was in a position with work where I was earning a lot more. So having the extra income from that next property didn't really move the needle. The problem was it took me a good couple of years to notice this and adjust. And in that period where I was buying, just carrying on like I was before, I made some decisions that have already cost me a lot of money.
None of us are born property investors, and not having a strategy right at the beginning when you set out, it's really common. I see it all the time. And Rob didn't have one, and you know what? Neither did I. My first buy-to-let, there was no real master plan behind it. It just happened. So if you're listening now thinking, uh-oh, don't worry, Rob's going to take us through an example where you can learn from his pain. Rob, what happened?
Okay, it doesn't start out sounding that painful, and that's why it was only when I went and actually ran the numbers to put this podcast together that I realised how much this had cost me. So about 3 years ago, at a point where I already should have switched from being a cash flow investor to a growth investor, but I hadn't realised this yet, I bought a property in Hull, which was fairly typical of the kind of stuff I was buying at the time. I bought it for £50,000. Yes, you can buy properties for £50,000 in Hull. Spent about £11,000 on it, on a bit of a refurb and all the other fees. Did all that with cash, then had the property revalued at £70,000, and that allowed me to pull out most of the money that I'd put in, leaving £8,500 left in. That's been rented out ever since, and the return on investment on the amount that I've got left in sounds really good. It's 27% a year. Now, as a percentage, that sounds fantastic. Where's the mistake here? That's the kind of thing that I could brag about having achieved. But here's the point. We're talking about small numbers here. As a percentage, it's fantastic. But as a pounds figure, the actual net income I get from this property is about £2,400 a year. That's about £200 a month.
So, a sexy ROI. You know, as Rob said, you could brag about that. Put it in a magazine even. You know, people would love that type of story. But the £200 a month, if you've already got what you need income-wise, or you're not focused about income right now, it's not life-changing. But luckily, we have an alternative property universe we can refer to where we can see what Rob could have done instead.
Yes, I went and looked at the kind of thing that I could have bought and probably would have bought if I'd been aware of this change in strategy. So if I was looking to invest for growth, I could have bought a one-bedroom flat in Manchester city centre, and it would have cost me about £140,000. And looking at the rents, I could rent that for about £650 a month. The gross yield on that is about 5.5%, and that's about 2% lower than Hull. So I wrote it off because I was looking for high yield, right? So why would I be interested in a 5.5% gross yield? So I ran the numbers a bit further, and after factoring in the mortgage and the service charge, management, bills and all that good stuff, the ROI would come out to about 6%. So 6% versus 27%. This sounds like no contest. However, in actual pound terms, that comes out to almost exactly £200 a month. So in income terms, each property would be producing pretty much exactly the same amount. Now, of course, the property is nearly 3 times as expensive, and there's no opportunity here to add value and pull the money back out. So I would have had far more of my own money tied up in this property. But the point is, by this point in my property journey, this shouldn't have mattered to me. There was a time when it did, but by this point, it wouldn't have done.
And Rob, also, you had to do work to get that 27%. It didn't just land on your lap. You had to do a full refurb. Whereas in the Manchester example you've used, you could have just purchased it and got it on with a letting agent and let it out straight away. You haven't had to do a load of work to get to that point.
Exactly. If I factored in my time, it would look even more grim. But let's not factor in my time because it's quite grim enough. Because here's the key part of this story. The property in Hull, I forced that appreciation with the refurb, but after that, it's not going to get any capital growth for quite a long time because of the nature of the property and where it is. At some point in the cycle, it will have growth, but that's going to be quite a while in coming, and that growth won't be particularly aggressive. However, prices in Manchester are up by 12% since that time, according to HomeTrack, and chances are a city centre flat would actually outperform the average. But let's just say that I'd bought that flat and it had gone up by 12% since I bought it, compared to Hull, which has gone up by 0%. What that would have meant for me would be a capital gain of £16,800. So I still would have had the £200 a month coming in, and I also would have had a capital gain of £16,800. So just off one purchase, that is the cost to me of not realising that my approach should have changed.
Ouch. A £16,800 mistake. That's quite a mistake. I smashed the glass yesterday and I was pretty annoyed, but it didn't cost me 16 grand. And although these properties aren't like for like, Rob, and there's different efforts and capital amounts needed for each project, what's incredible, and I think we shouldn't miss here, is that nearly £17,000 is just in 3 years. What's that property going to be in 20 years? If you look at it and it's only 3 years in, and that's the type of money made. Of course, there's going to be lots of things happen over 20 years, but it's a very, very strong start, and you could probably get quite excited, if you purchased it, of course, of where that could be in 10, 20 years' time.
Thanks, Rob. Do you just want to twist that a little bit more? I'm not sure I'm feeling it enough right now.
I just want people to get the lesson, Rob. Now, this episode is all about looking at capital growth versus income chasing or yield chasing, which approach you should take. But I think it's really important to say that cash flow is king, whatever approach you take. If you are going for capital growth, you still need a cash flow. You want an asset that pays you. You don't want to be putting money into a property every month. Now, luckily, in the current market, there are stress tests if you purchase with a mortgage that force you to make an income every single month. And they're quite stringent, those stress tests as well. So you would make an income. So if the market gets a bit too hot for capital growth and you haven't seen it, the stress tests will. So you will make cash flow regardless. But it's really important to highlight that you're not ignoring cash flow by going for growth. It's just not your primary driver.
Yeah, and even if you don't care about cash flow at all, you're completely fixated on the long term, then don't take it for granted. Not only do you need it, but it can quickly add up, and it can go a long way to building your deposit for the next one.
Now, Rob's highlighted a mistake here that he's made, but you can make mistakes whichever approach you go for. You can go for a property that you believe is going to deliver you capital growth, but get it wrong, and you end up with a property that may just delivering a yield for you. So the cash flow is really important. And I am one of those people who've made that mistake. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks' time.
I think another point that's worth making is that you do generally have to make a choice between one or the other. You can, especially at the right time in the cycle, buy a property that is high yielding and is going to have some good growth. But that's not something that's easy to do, and it's not something you can do at all points in the cycle. Generally, you're making a choice because they are different types of stock, different types of location. In general, if you're buying for growth, it means a better quality of stock, a more prime location, and probably an easier hold as well, because you tend to get a better tenant type and less trouble collecting the rent and less maintenance. That doesn't always hold, but it's a fair generalisation. And that's why it's so important to know which strategy you're going for, because it's not like you can suddenly flick a switch and change it. The properties you've bought will be geared to either one or the other. So if you discover, like I did, that you've bought the wrong type of property, then it's quite a difficult situation to get out of.
So which strategy is best? Well, hopefully by now you've learned there isn't a general best strategy. It's what's best for you. Understand where you're at right now. Take time to assess your current situation and what's important to you. And then be very deliberate about the investments you want to make. If you are trying to get out the rat race in the next few years, then go all in on income. If this is a retirement play or a legacy play for future generations, then go for capital growth. But whichever you do, don't get distracted by the other. Sometimes you could be going for capital growth and suddenly a 27% ROI in Hull will look very appealing and get your attention. But equally, if you're going for return and a wonderful new build appears in a city centre of your liking and you start to dream about having that in your portfolio, stop. Get focused, get back to what you're doing, because straying into another strategy that doesn't currently suit you is only going to delay you from hitting your goals.
Exactly, and that's the critical point. We talk about goals a lot on this podcast, but that's why. You need to know your goals. You need to know what you're in it for in order to make the right decisions. And if you're an idiot like me and you make the wrong decisions, as we've seen, it can end up being very costly. But like Rob said earlier, in general, people don't start out in property by thinking this way. If you are starting out now, then think yourself lucky for the fact that you're listening to the Property Podcast, or rather being sensible enough to educate yourself. We weren't. Most people aren't. And the result is their first couple of purchases, it's kind of luck as to whether they work out long term or not. If you're just starting out and you're educating yourself first, you can shortcut that process and you can start making the right purchases right from the very start. However, if you are a little bit further in and you just start thinking about it now, you think, you know what, actually, I don't know if my current purchases are serving me, then don't worry about it too much, because the great thing about property is even the mistakes look pretty good. Having some income coming in is no bad thing. And definitely listen to next week's episode, where we'll be talking about how to review your existing portfolio, how to optimize it, and how to make sure it's still working for you as it should be. And
Rob, if all my mistakes gave myself a 27% return, I'd be pretty happy. So I don't really think you're an idiot. So Hub Extra is coming up and Rob D's dug out a cracker for us. But before we get there, let's find these wonderful human beings and hubbers who've left us 5-star reviews in iTunes. So first up is Miles, and Miles says, I have been listening to your podcast now for a year and I am really enjoying it. Very informative and current, as some big topics have a great deal of big picture thinking. I'm on my third development, recent ones without planning and applying for 10 units, so very much in the deep end and learning loads. I've been using some of your tips and expertise to help me get more acquainted with the property world, so a massive thank you. Thank you, Miles. And Nobby says, apologies for joining you late. I've been catching up with your previous podcast. Such an invaluable advice. Real opener. Loved Santa on the last show. Merry Christmas. As you can see, we're a little bit behind the reviews because so many come in. But thank you for your Merry Christmas in 2017, Nobby.
Now, Hub Extra time, where we just squeeze in that extra little bit before the end of the show, and we back it up with the Hub Extra email, which hits the inbox of Property Hub subscribers on a Friday morning. This week, a brilliant resource if you're a big reader, and especially if you read online. Because if you're like me, you read a lot of books on Kindle and you might be reading articles in Instapaper, and as you go along, you come across some really interesting ideas, so you highlight them to come back to later, and then you never come back to them later and actually review your highlights. Well, this week's resource is called Readwise. It's at readwise.io, and what it does is really simple. It hooks up to your online account, it synchronizes all your highlights, then every day it emails you a small selection of about 4 or 5 things that you've highlighted in the past, so you can review them. To be honest, I don't know if there's some kind of algorithm behind it or if it just picks them at random, but it's really useful because when you're in your inbox going through things, as you do anyway, it's the kind of thing that most people look at every day, and it makes it really easy for you to look at a selection of random highlights from the past. And in the time that I've been reading it, it's surfaced all kinds of things that I'd completely forgotten I'd read, I never would have come back to otherwise, but it's reminded me of that idea, or it's prompted me to follow up on something, and it's done it with practically no effort at all. So if you are a big reader and a serial highlighter, I'd say that's well worth checking out.
So what did you think of Rob D's mistake? And what mistakes have you made? Let us know. Head over to thepropertyhub.net/change strategy and join in the forum discussion there, or head along to one of our social channels on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, where you can find us at Property Hub UK. And if you'd like to find out what Rob and I do behind the scenes and all the businesses we work on, then join us on our next Discovery webinar, which you'll find at thepropertyhub.net/discover. So plenty to keep you busy until we're back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob. And of course, we'll be back next Thursday with the Property Podcast. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.